So, first off, welcome to Think Week. We're thrilled that you're here. For those of you that don't know, this is the first of 12 talks that are going to be going on throughout the week here on University of Mainz campus. We're really excited about it. Some big names talking to you this week. I'm not one of them. I'm the starting act for Michael Behe, who will be up during our second lunch hour talking about, let me make sure I get this right, experimental limits to Darwinian evolution, which is going to be an exciting talk that I'm looking forward to. We are going to be here 3 times a day all week with the goal of creating a place where we can talk about what do we believe, why do we believe what we believe, and does it really answer the questions you're asking about your life or not? We're here for dialogue and for conversation. As Christians, we genuinely believe that the truth speaks for itself and that those who seek the truth find it, which means that we want to have questions and we want to have conversations, and we're really looking forward to it. And so, on that note, my name is Ivy Tyson. Hi, I should have started with that. It's too late now. I actually hail from Colorado Springs, and I also hail from a strange and distant alien planet called the social sciences. Don't panic. So, one of the things that I noticed when I looked up the University of Mainz, when I found out that I was going to be talking here, was, so what are the social science options for people on this campus? And I'm sure most of the students can attest, I'm seeing smiles already. Not many would be the answer to this question. A lot of the things that we talk about here in regards to social sciences, in regards to today's question of what is a human being, all happen in the context of technology and society. What I'm going to do today is talk about it from a slightly different angle, that of anthropology. And more specifically, as a Christian in anthropology, I represent a very small, strange sliver on the Venn diagram of academics. Christian anthropologists talking at a school like Mainz do not happen often, so enjoy this while you can. Okay, so the question today is, what is a human being? And if you think I'm actually going to answer this in half an hour or less, I'm sorry. What instead I'm going to do is talk about, in kind of bite-sized pieces, some of the ways we talk about human beings and some of the things that we tell ourselves. So let me get started. I think I'm part of a generation, this generation we're in now, that tend to be a lot of things at once. I have studied anthropology and history and theology. I teach public speaking and debate. I help run an online education program for philosophy. I've been a lot of things, and I think I'm fairly typical of people my age. But the first thing I was, before I was anything else, was a storyteller. I was one of those kids that was determined to be a writer from the time that she knew what words were. And so when I was about 5 years old, I would get out the printer paper that my parents told me not to use and take a marker, because even at the age of 5, I hated erasing. And I would write out these stories about my best friend, who at the time was a stuffed animal penguin named Joe. And I would send Joe to the far reaches of the universe that my 5-year-old mind could imagine. He would go on these epic adventures to, like, the grocery store or the library and do exciting things. And most of the words would be misspelled and half of the letters were backwards, but they were my stories and I was proud of them. And then when I was done, I would hand this clump of papers over to my mother. And my mother happens to be a fabulous artist. And my mom, out of the kindness and generosity of her heart, would illustrate these things. And they would be fabulous. These great color pencil illustrations of a penguin dashing through a library to return a late book, right? Her illustrations far outstripped the capacity of my story and the words I was using to tell the story. Okay, well, why on earth am I telling you that? Because years later, when I started my anthropology degree at university, I was shocked to discover that I was having the same problem at university as I had as a 5-year-old when I gave those stories to my mom, only in reverse, and this was it. Anthropology, the social science, is the study of human beings, and it looks at society, at our relationships with each other, and our definitions of ourselves, and then gives us an explanation for it. Here's the deal. The picture that we see, the image of the human being, the actual data that we're getting in, I'm going to argue today, far outstrips the caption that we are putting on the picture to describe what a human being is. We don't have good answers for a lot of these questions, and I'm not just saying that as a Christian, if you're worried about bias. I'm saying this as an anthropologist. So we're going to talk about this in 3 ways today. I'm going to talk very briefly about the ways that human beings, the way that we in the anthropology world talk about society, and what stories we tell ourselves. We're going to talk about the stories we tell ourselves in regard to interpersonal relationships, and then we're going to talk about the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. I think humans are innately storytellers. I think that the way that we approach ourselves and human beings is primarily through stories. So let's get started. Probably the most common story we hear today about society, humans in general, the mass that is culture, is this concept of humanism. Humanism and naturalism. So for those of you not necessarily comfortable with the terms, naturalism is the worldview, so the way of approaching the world that says the only things that are real are the physical universe. So time, matter, and chance have to account for absolutely everything we see. Okay, so humanism then, and actually I'm going to back up a little bit. So humanism is a democratic and ethical life stance which affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their own lives. I love the American Humanist Society because they're the kind of people that use the word life stance in a normal sentence. Ethical life stance, which affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their own lives. We need to be very careful right up front here to talk about the word faith. Don't freak out for those of you that don't necessarily like it. When I'm talking about faith, you'll notice for those of you that have been trying to read these red shirts everyone's been wearing the whole week, it says no more blind faith. And so when I say the word faith, I want to be really clear that when I'm talking about faith, I'm not talking about faith in the total absence of evidence. I'm talking about faith in the philosophical concept of, philosophers call this an epistemological chain, which is a fancy way of saying, how do you know what you know? And if you take all the facts assembled in your life and you try to figure out how do I know what I know, and I go back and back and back, at some point in the epistemological chain of a fact, you have to say, I know this because I trust the person that told me it. I know this fact because I believe the person who told me. And it could be the person who wrote the textbook, it could be the person who taught it in the class. The vast majority of facts in our life we haven't double-checked. I'm not saying that's wrong. That's just something that we all do. Faith and trust are one of the primary ways of knowing as a human being. That's just the way it is. And we see this is true in the sciences. We come into an experiment with a particular set of assumptions about how the universe works. That creates our hypothesis, which we then test with experimentation and data. And we change that hypothesis depending on what the data and the evidence tells us. But we have to recognize we come in with those assumptions first. So when I talk about faith in a minute here, I want to make it clear that it's not a dirty word. It's something that every human being does. The question isn't whether we have faith. The question is, what is that faith in, and how does that influence our hypothesis? So with that in mind, this is what I want to, before I read this quote. So humanism is this idea that's an outlook or a system that stresses that human beings have a potential value, and they have an inherent value, and have the capability to create their own meaning, and that they have a responsibility to better themselves and the world they live in. This has a lot of positive things going for it. We hear it a lot, especially on campuses like this. The question is whether the worldview of naturalism, fate, so time, chance, matter, what you see is what you get, and the story of humanism that says human beings are valuable and that they're capable of bettering the universe. The question is whether the data and the story, the interpretation, actually match up or not. So, interestingly, John Gray is an atheist philosopher, so someone who says that absolutely God does not exist, and basically we just have to deal with it. I appreciate his honesty. Wrote a book called Straw Dogs, and the subtitle is Thoughts on Humans and Other Animals, so that gives you a good idea of his approach. This is what John Gray says about humanism. He says, most people today think that they belong to a species that can be master of its destiny. This is faith, not science. And this is just to make this clear, that when I talked about faith earlier, this is the point we're at. The question, what does it mean, what is a human being, is almost a bit of a trick question, because it sounds like we should be able to answer it biologically. We find out extraordinarily quickly in the field of anthropology that we can't. What you think about what a human being is relies very heavily on what you think it is possible for a human being to be. So going on from John Gray, progress. Humanism is very dependent on the concept of progress. The idea that the world is increasingly getting better, the idea that species are being selected to be better, to be to their advantage. The question is, how do we know what's worse and what's better? Yeah, let me just read this from John Gray. He says it better. You know how sometimes you're trying to explain something that somebody smarter than you has already said? Okay, check this out. To believe in progress, so the idea that things go from worse to better, that human beings are capable of intervening in the universe to make it better. To believe in progress is to believe that by using the new powers given us by growing scientific knowledge, which this campus is big on, by the way, humans can free themselves from the limits that frame the lives of other animals. This is the hope of nearly everybody nowadays, but it is groundless, so says John Gray. For though human knowledge will very likely continue to grow, and with it human power, the human animal will stay the same. A highly inventive species that is also one of the most predatory and destructive. Gray's got a point. So this is the crux of the difficulty in anthropology and in social theory right now, is that naturalism says that humans are just another form of animal. There is nothing special about us. We're just more dominant and we're more predatory, and we have become the dominant species on the planet through nature and through force and through time and through the luck of natural chance. Okay, but the problem is that humanism seems to tell us the story that we are especially equipped to be able to create meaning for ourselves and to be able to transcend and escape naturalism. Naturalism doesn't provide for that. Humanism insists on it. And so the question is, how do we maintain both? And honestly, there isn't an easy answer here. But then the question is, well, then how did humanism get started in the first place? Because that seems ridiculous. A lot of naturalists now identify as humanists. And so the question is, well, then how do we reconcile the two? And where did humanism come from? Well, humanism is actually a philosophical response to Christianity, which I find fascinating. And even more interestingly, I'd suggest you go read John Gray's book if you want to learn more about this, but humanism takes a lot of components from the Christian worldview and espouses them as true, even while denying Christianity. And the one that it takes most importantly is the idea that human beings are unique in the universe and somehow capable of defining themselves and somehow capable of not only engendering meaning, but even caring about what meaning is. The fact that we ask, the fact that we wonder about the meaning of our lives sets us apart from the rest of nature, as far as we can tell. So why is that? It says humanists insist that by using our knowledge, we can control our environment and flourish as never before. Progress, technology, science. In affirming this, they renew one of Christianity's most dubious promises, that salvation is open to all. The humanist belief in progress is only a secular version of this Christian faith. Gray's really got a point here. Whether you agree with Christianity or not is not actually the issue here. I'm going to espouse to you. The question is, if you don't believe in Christianity, you don't have a basis for the claims of humanism. We're telling ourselves a story that's printed out of thin air, and we're trying to apply it to a set of data that doesn't necessarily support it. So Gray is saying that you can have naturalism or you can have humanism, but you can't have both. Okay, we'll come back to that at the end. One last thought. The idea of progress rests on the belief that the growth of knowledge and the advance of the species go together. If not now, then in the long run. That's evolutionary theory 101. The biblical myth of the fall of man, however, contains the forbidden truth. Knowledge does not make us free. It leaves us as we have always been, prey to every kind of folly. The question becomes, can we change ourselves or not? Can we control our destiny? If humanism isn't the place we can go to do that, then what are our other options? Okay, well, let's look at another option then. Let's get rid of the society bit for a minute anyway. It's abstract and it's large. Let's go a level down. Let's instead talk about interpersonal relationships. Okay, so one of the most prevalent stories of our generation right now in regards to interpersonal relationships, how we talk to each other about each other, is the whole concept of human rights. Human rights is an extremely important issue in the world right now, but a lot of its roots live in anthropology. Because in order to talk about human rights, we have to talk about, well, what is a human being? And so what a human being is will determine what we're responsible for with each other, how we have to act with each other, what are we obligated to do. Morality becomes a question at this point. We see increasing amounts of horror stories on the news about violations of human rights. I'm not denying that. The question becomes, what stories are we telling ourselves about interpersonal relationships? And why are we horrified by human rights violations? Why are they a bad thing? And so human rights academia, so the field of human rights, is going to tell you that human rights are essentially three things. And this is something we all understand about human rights. So the backbones of human rights understanding are that, one, national and international law are subject to a higher law. So governments aren't the final authority on defining what human rights are or aren't. Most of us agree with this because you look at a country or particular periods in even our own country's history, and you say, what the government was doing, what the authority was doing wasn't right. They weren't treating people the way they should be treated. And a lot of human rights movements are involved in changing the authority structure, changing the policy of a country to some higher standard, some different standard of human beings. Okay, so that's backbone number one. Backbone number two is inherency. Human rights are inherent to humans simply because they are human. You don't have to do anything to earn human rights. If you're a human, you just get human rights. Finally, universality. Human rights have to apply universally to all human beings, regardless of gender, ethnicity, location, time period, anything else. So, transcends governmental law, inherency, and universality. These are the commonly understood backbones of human rights. And I'm harping on this just to make it really clear then when I say that if we take naturalism, if we take time, chance, matter as our assumption going into this conversation, this story of human rights becomes extraordinarily hard to support for a variety of reasons. One, naturalistic views of the society and culture are going to tell you that morality, such as it is purely a societal construct. Whoever is in charge gets to determine what's right and wrong. And this is how evolutionary theory, from the purely naturalistic standpoint, works. The strongest makes the rules. And the strongest makes the rules to their advantage to keep being the strongest. And that's the closest we can get to talking about morality. I imagine most people aren't comfortable with that, and for good reason. Okay, and then the second one, we're talking about inherency, that human rights are inherent to humans simply because they are human. It gets tricky. One, the question is, what does it mean to be inherently human? At what point do you start being a human, and what point do you stop being a human? Not just in the evolutionary process as a whole, but us individually. And that goes a lot into, rationality, capability, agency. This is how we start trying to ground the idea of human rights and human dignity. But if you start talking about rationality and capability, what we get stuck in is a place where no matter what you do, no matter where you draw the line on human rights, you're leaving a human being out. There's always somebody less rational than you, somebody less capable, somebody less able. It is nearly impossible to draw a line from a naturalistic standpoint that includes all humans and only humans. This is universality. And in fact, anthropology and the field of human rights and civil rights has acknowledged this to the point where Warty, who's a very prominent human rights scholar right now, says that our backing away from these fundamental questions is one of the important intellectual advances of our century. We've gotten to the point now where we have to admit that we think that human rights are very important. And from the humanistic standpoint, human rights are extraordinarily important. But if humanism doesn't have strong explanatory power in the realm of naturalism, where on earth do we base our conception of human rights? And it gets messy fast. And the answer is, we end up with the feeling that human rights is important without necessarily having a story, a cohesive worldview that backs up why we should bother and why we should care. I find that troubling, just from an anthropologist's point of view and from an academic's point of view. Let me take a caveat here and say that I find this extraordinarily troubling, that human rights is increasingly popular and increasingly important in modern parlance and increasingly ignored and undefined in academia. As soon as you get a gap between those two things, bad things happen. And I'm worried that that gap is already happening. And we really do need to address it. back to John Gray again, he says that the political action has come to be a surrogate for salvation. But no political project can deliver humanity from its natural condition. So the question is, what is the natural condition of humanity? We get stuck in this very strange place as anthropologists who espouse to naturalism, a very strange place of saying this is how the world works. But all the stories I tell myself about people contradict that. And so the question is, which one do you take, and how do you know which one to take? And so what we have to do is talk about, what do I actually see about human beings? What's the data? What are we using to make these determinations? What better explains humanity? Is it the idea that humanism kind of edges towards, the Christian worldview, actually, that humanism edges towards, that says human beings really are unique? And there really is something about every single human being that requires us to think in terms of morality and meaning and destiny and origin? Or is it really naturalism that says human beings are no different than any other animal, should not be treated differently than any other animal, and can't expect more than any other animal? I think most of us, at the end of the day, our beliefs run much more towards the former than the latter. And so this is what I want to talk about finally. We've talked about the stories we tell ourselves in regards to society. What are you telling yourself? Does it really fit the evidence you see or not? How about interpersonal relationships? If you really care about human rights, and I think that we all should, and we should be concerned about the practice and the action of human rights, does your worldview, do the stories you tell yourselves about other people, allow you to have a basis for prioritizing human rights and prioritizing the people around you? But finally, and I think maybe most importantly, I want to talk about this last one, stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So let me tell you one more story from me. When I grew up in a Christian household, and the longer I stayed in a Christian household, the more convinced I became that it was true. I know that's not always how that story ends, but that's how it ended for me. The more time I spent looking into Christianity, the more convinced I became that this made a lot of sense, that it was a story that really had explanatory power for the things I saw in people and in my life. But then when I was 16, my dad, who had always traveled quite a lot, one day picked up his bags and left for another business trip and could not bear the thought of coming back. He was done, and he left. And it says something about how often he was gone before, that it took 6 months for me to notice that this time he actually wasn't coming back. Now, all this to say, this isn't an unusual story, especially for people our age, whatever that's about. But here's what I learned through this experience, is that my entire life, I had kind of told myself, because my dad was gone so often, what I learned was, I'm not worth staying for. And what had been a footnote in the story of my life up until then, when my dad left, became the text of my life. I am not worth loving. I am not worth staying for, because he didn't stay. And he was supposed to be the one that would stay, right? I think we really have that kind of expectation of our parents, at least early on. And through that process, and through dealing with that, here's the thing I learned. This has been one of the most important things I've learned in my life. Most of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are lies. We are not the best judge of our own actions, of our own impact, of our own value. We're too close. Desmond Morris, who is a zoologist who was at the edge of the neo-Darwinist movement when he wrote his book, Naked Apes, says it this way: from a purely scientific perspective, it is extraordinarily difficult to observe human beings because of the unfortunate bias that we are all, in fact, human beings. And I really think that's true. The question becomes, what stories do we tell ourselves about ourselves? How do we know that they're true? Why do we believe what we believe about ourselves? So I want to talk about one more type of story we tell ourselves, and those are love stories. Love is a massive and important thing to us as human beings, increasingly so. We are a culture obsessed with love. Okay, but how do we define love? A lot of the times we define love, and we experience love as emotions. And we talk about love very emotionally, but clearly from a scientific standpoint, that gets us absolutely nowhere. What's the data on love? The data on love that we have to try and account for and have to try to interpret comes via the way of actions. Okay, so what does love look like from a data practical application standpoint? Well, let me offer you a list. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy. It doesn't boast. It's not arrogant. It's not rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes in all things, and it endures all things. Love never ends. That's the Christian definition of love, by the way. It's out of a Bible passage in the New Testament, but here's the point. I think somewhere inside of us, all of us really, really want that kind of love in our lives. As a Christian, I'm okay with that. Because as a Christian, I believe that there is a God who rules the universe who is capable of doing all of that. That all of those things are, that it's possible to have a love that looks like that. I think loneliness is one of the great epidemics of this generation. I think that we spend an awful lot of time wishing for these things. And I think a lot of us are right now in a worldview, are telling ourselves a story that says this isn't possible. Because let me tell you something about naturalism. Everything ends. You, the people you love, the relationships you have, absolutely everything ends in naturalism. And the kind of love that God describes here isn't the kind of love that preserves a species. Actually, it's the kind of love that gets people killed. How important is it to you that the way you view the world really aligns with what the world is like? How important is it to you that the way you treat other people is the way that they should be treated? How important is it to you to be loved? I think for most of us the answer is very. And I think for some of us the question then is, well, I don't know what to do about it, right? And really all I want to do today is to bring this to your attention that, look, I think the data suggests that we as humans are convinced that we are unique in the universe, that there is meaning in our lives, that it matters what we do and what we don't do, that love is important. Even if I think it's impossible, love is important. And my question to you is, if you don't think that that love is possible, why do we want it so badly? How is it possible that an entire biological community is desperate for a form of relationship that isn't possible in a naturalistic universe? Can't imagine that it's good for us. My question to you today is, why do you believe what you believe? What stories are you telling yourself about yourself? And can you live with the answers or not? If you can, if you have a worldview that you're really comfortable with, awesome, let's talk about it. We want to talk about it. We want to learn from each other. If you are uneasy with the answers that your worldview seems to suggest, let's talk about it. We're here all week. There's a lot of really interesting talks about all kinds of things this week. Ask yourself the questions. I don't think love is a hallucination of the deluded humanist mind in a naturalist universe. I think that love is reality, and I think that it explains the data that we see about people, about each other, and about ourselves. But I'd love to hear more from you on that. So if you will take a look at the cards in front of you, you will note that they have the big question marks on them. We're going to have a time of Q&A after this, and so this is your opportunity to write a question that you'd like me to answer in the Q&A session about anything I said in this talk or anything about Christianity or God generally. Boy, I'm going to regret opening that up, but it's too late now. Go ahead and write down your question, and we're going to toss them to the sides. We ask that you put, especially if you're a student, we ask that you put your name or your contact information. We probably won't be able to get through all the questions in the room, but we guarantee you that if you put your contact information on the card with your question, we will get back to you with an answer to your question. Whether it's through email or text, or if you want to sit and have a cup of coffee with us, we would absolutely love to do that for you, because we're all about conversation this week. And then the last thing I'm going to do is encourage you to think very carefully about if this kind of like struck your interest, or if you just sort of like to know more, if you're wondering whether God might even be a remote possibility, I'm going to encourage you to take a step towards trying to find what's true. The Bible says, if you seek truth, you will find it. It's very scientific, isn't it? Here's your opportunity at the end of this talk to take a moment, and if you're willing, send a thought out into the void that might have a God in it and say, if you are there, then show me. If we're willing to be in a place where we say, I want the truth to be known, I want my life to reflect how the universe actually works, as a Christian, I believe that brings us a long way to aligning ourselves to God. Because if God is true, then he should be at the end of that journey. But I'd encourage you to try it. In fact, I'd challenge you to try it and see what you find. And tell us what you find. I'd be curious to see. All right, thank you. Go ahead and fill out your cards, and I'll be back in the Q&A. Oh, and please. Questions. I don't have time for all of them, so I just kind of picked out a couple to talk about for a few minutes. Let's put the phone in the pocket that doesn't already have a phone in it. There we go. Okay. So, first question, which I think is excellent, says, are you saying that humanism and or naturalism does not support agape love? For those unfamiliar, agape is one of the 3 words used in the Bible to talk about different kinds of love. And agape love is the kind that's normally reserved for like the way that God loves people, which is massively, and regardless of what you do or think or say, a kind of, transcendent, like really epic love story kind of love. Not romantic necessarily, not friendship, but something besides that, kind of the essence of love, which I think is a good question. So part of the thing we have to deal with is that the concept of agape love is fairly specific to Scripture. I would tell you that I think that fits very well the definition of the kind of love, like I was saying earlier, that we very much want to have as human beings. Am I saying that humanism and or naturalism does not support that kind of love? Yes. I think you have an extraordinarily hard time explaining how agape love, how that kind of all-encompassing kind of love is good for a species at all. It makes very little sense that kind of love gets selected for. It's the kind of love that causes people to die for each other, even when it makes no sense for preserving offspring or anything else. Self-sacrifice is not a hugely selected for trait in a naturalistic evolutionary society. As a matter of fact, doing what's best for you and for your family unit and for your kin is the way that naturalism works. It's the way that one species becomes the dominant species. It's the way that communities naturally self-select out the weaker members. Self-sacrifice, agape kind of love, doesn't make sense in naturalism. It's not necessary. So, yes, I guess that's what I'm saying. Second question, please provide more explanation on why the difference between academia and governments on human rights is bad. Great question. I'm hoping I didn't say that quite exactly, though it's a fair point. The real question is, for me, the theory of human rights, so kind of the academic end, and then the practice of human rights, which, to be fair, is governments, but it's also just individual people going about their daily lives. So my concern is the gap between the theory, so the stories we tell ourselves about human rights, and then what we actually do about human rights. Because what you think about it will determine what you do about it. And I'm very concerned that if the academic world continues on the route that it is, saying that we can't define it, we can't talk about it, we can't figure out what a human being is exactly, so we can't tell you what human rights are exactly, except that they're important. Well, saying it's important, but I can't tell you why it's important, isn't really a great platform for social action or for individual action. So I think that if you need a personal conviction about human rights to do something about it, just like you do anything else. So that's why I would say that I find that gap concerning. As both a social activist and an academic, I think that we need, oh good, thanks Nate. Subtle, thanks. We really do, we need conversations very seriously. We need theories that actually allow for a positive platform of human rights. And if we don't have that, then I don't know why we have a field of human rights to start with. I really don't. I don't think we've gotten to that point yet, but I see the trend turning that way in a worrying direction, partly because of the reliance on humanism and humanism's incompatibility with naturalism. Next question. Some famous atheists, like Christopher Hitchens, believe in morality apart from God. So how do you fit that into your story? This is a really fabulous question. So I'm going to give you the very short version, I think, of the answer to this question, which is this. If good and bad, if morality only exists at the societal level, then you cannot be a proponent of human rights. And that is an extraordinarily strong statement, but I think that logically it follows, because here's the deal. Naturalism says that the majority in the community is the victor in the community. So whoever's the strongest wins, which means that Martin Luther King Jr. is an anomaly in the naturalistic view of the human being. If we are time and chance and matter, then Martin Luther King Jr. is saying you treating this particular subset of human beings as less than human is morally wrong and it's reprehensible and you need to change it, is kind of silly. Now, clearly we should have issues with that because people are people, but you have to have a worldview and you have to have a framework to talk about your life that allows you to say that every human being is equally, universally, inherently worth the same amount. And naturalism tells you that if you don't perform as well, or if you allow yourself to become the weaker party, or if unfortunately by time and chance and matter you end up being the weaker member of a society, that's just what happens. You're out of luck. That's harsh, and it sounds really strong that way. But the question becomes, what determines what's right and wrong? And if it's purely a matter of majority definition, if it's purely a matter of might makes right, like naturalism tells us, then might makes right. Christianity tells a very different story. It says that goodness and truth are actually a person, that they are, in fact, characteristics of a relational God who reveals himself. And that God, the existence of that God, is right and is truth. And that turns it into a very different conversation. It means that Martin Luther King Jr. could look at one of the most powerful governments on the planet and say, you're doing it wrong. And I'm calling you to a higher standard, and I'm telling you what human beings are supposed to be. And I can tell you what's right because God is right. And you determining whether a government or an action or a field or a person is right is whether it lines up with that, not whether it lines up with the majority. So those are two different. One worldview says morality is purely a societal construct, or a biological construct, or both. And the other one says morality is based on the character of a divine and eternal God. And how you answer that question is clearly very much going to affect how you answer all of the rest of it. And then finally, we'll just do this as the last one, but I think it's a great question. How can you respond to someone who says that humans are just animals? We both think, we feel, we decide, we hurt. And kind of foreseeing the next objection. Just saying we have a soul doesn't work because if they don't believe in souls, that doesn't help, which is a really excellent point, by the way. This is a really good question. And this is a fascinating one, and I'd love to have a conversation with you if you have thoughts about this. The question becomes, if we really do believe that humans are just another set of animals, no difference, just another animal, just another dominant animal, a fairly predatory one, we'll come to the end of our time, we'll be done, we'll go extinct like everybody else does, natural selection, that whole deal. Okay, so if you really do believe that, then my challenge to you is, does your life reflect that belief? Are you comfortable only expecting of other people what you expect of an animal? Are you comfortable living your life around other people and treating yourself as if you're just an animal? Are you not worried about the moral structure of a society? Are you not worried about... Well, I'll stop that there. How do I respond to someone who says humans are just animals? I'd respond, do you really think that's true? And if you do, I'd love to talk to you about it. But there's a lot of things that I think we innately have to give up about ourselves, about human rights, about the way we talk about societies, about the way we create our laws. And by the way, even the creation of laws and the existence of laws makes this conversation really complicated. Humans have produced things that other animals haven't. We do think, and we feel, and we decide, and we hurt, but we also have philosophy. And we ask, what is the meaning of life? And we make laws to protect and defend our interests. It's not as simple as human beings just being another animal. Are there similarities? Yes. Are there things we still have to account for that are anomalies in both biology and things like cultural studies and in all the branches of anthropology? Yeah, we still have to deal with that as well. Oh, good. One more. Nearly done. If Jesus was born by the virgin birth with no human father, how come he's a dude? Awesome. We're going to end with this one just because it's great. Thank you for actually taking me up on the any question about Christianity umbrella. Fabulous. So 2 things. One, Jesus is a specific actual human being that lived, and the Christian claim is that Jesus fulfilled prophecies written down by people who lived thousands of years before him about specifically what he was going to be like, where he would live, what he would do, and the kind of decisions he would make. So I think part of the reason that Jesus is a dude was to make the point that God really did send Jesus. It was so specific, these prophecies, that it was down to he'd be born in Bethlehem. He'd be born in a particular place at a particular time, and he would make these decisions, and he'd be a dude. And you know what? They're all true, which is pretty cool. But the second thing that I think is equally important here is the fact that, and stay tuned for talks for the rest of the week, we're going to touch on this. Stay tuned for the fact that the point of Christianity today, the point that I could talk to you about everything in the Christian worldview that we've talked about today, is because I am convinced of the historical proof that Jesus was an actual person who came into history, who talked to people, who walked and ate and died, and stopped being dead 3 days later, and has not died again since. And that is a huge claim, and it's one that has to be validated, but it's one that I think is validated. And that's why the Christian God is so important, because he is absolutely just and huge and powerful and set apart, but he's also the only God in human conception that came to us in a form that we recognize as a human being, to take on things that we couldn't do ourselves, to make amends for things we couldn't make amends of ourselves. And that's why Christianity is beautiful, is because Jesus was a dude. Okay, thanks very much for your time. And